Hi everyone, and welcome to Chapter 8, which is photosynthesis. And like I said with the previous chapter, I completely understand that cellular respiration and photosynthesis tend to be the chapters that students dislike the most, but I will try and make it as painless as possible. And keep in mind, some of the concepts that we go over today, you've already encountered in some of the other chapters. So just always remind yourself of the previous material, and it will help you better understand the new concepts that we cover. Now, before we go into the concept of photosynthesis, I do want to talk a little generally about the organisms that will be performing that process. And when we talk about photosynthetic organisms, we mean organisms that can use solar energy, meaning energy from the sunlight, and convert it into chemical energy. And we call these kind of organisms autotrophs or producers because they're producing their own food. And autotroph is basically the scientific way of saying that because auto means self and troph means feeding. So autotroph is self-feeding. These organisms include plants, algae, and cyanobacteria, which I've mentioned as some of the first organisms to exist. Okay, so plants, algae, and cyanobacteria are all examples of photosynthetic organisms. Now, if we focus on plants for a little bit, plants, their photosynthesis, you will see in their basically greenness, I call it. So the green parts of the plant tell you that those are photosynthetic parts of the plant. And what makes them green is because they contain those energy organelles that we've mentioned already, which are the chloroplasts. And the chloroplasts contain the chlorophyll, which captures sunlight and really pushes forward and allows photosynthesis to occur. Okay, so they are green because of the chloroplasts that contain chlorophyll. Now, we visually see them as green because they are reflecting the green wavelengths of light. And at that same time, they're absorbing red and blue wavelengths. So instead, we see them as green. This is a little recap slide for you to pause the video and jot down some of the notes that I said so far, just in case you were unsure of any of the spelling. Now, when we talk about photosynthesis, it's important to realize that there are two sets of reactions involved in this main process. Now, first you have the light reactions, and as that name suggests, this only occurs when sunlight is available. And when is sunlight available? During the daytime. Okay, so the light reactions occur during daytime when sunlight's available, and what the plant or organism is doing in this reaction is it's capturing energy. It's the energy capturing reactions that give the high energy to electrons and pushes them forward down the electron transport chain, which you've seen the electron transport chain in cellular respiration as well. And so that you've seen that as these high energy electrons move down the electron transport chain to low energy, at each of the steps, you saw ATP coming out as usable energy. Okay? Now, what happens during these light reactions is the solar energy or the sunlight energy converts to chemical energy in the form of ATP, which you are all experts at now, as well as NADPH, which we saw in the previous chapter as well in cellular respiration. Okay, and that's part of driving the Calvin cycle, which we also saw a similar reaction in the cellular respiration as well. Now, the Calvin cycle reactions in photosynthesis, these are called dark reactions. okay? Not because they're morbid, but because they occur after the light reactions. And if they're dark reactions, what does that tell you? They don't require sunlight. Okay, so the light reactions require sunlight daytime. The Calvin cycle does not require sunlight. So circle SAR highlight that difference between the two reactions. And what happens in this Calvin cycle is these reactions are in charge of getting those chemical energy products, okay, into a different form. So it's kind of like in cellular respiration when you saw that throughout each of the phases, you were breaking down glucose more and more into each of these different kinds of intermediates. Well, now in photosynthesis, you're going the opposite route. You are converting these forms of energy, these ATP, NADP, pH, into a different form of chemical energy, which now is the carbohydrate. And you can circle carbohydrates and remind yourself that this is usually glucose. Okay, so a lot of these energy reactions, when we say carbohydrates, we mean glucose or we're saying sugar. Okay, fancy way of saying sugar. And remember, that makes sense that you are trying to make carbohydrate or sugar in photosynthesis, because remember we said that this process is usually the opposite formula to cellular respiration. And in cellular respiration, what were you doing? You were breaking down sugar or glucose. Okay? And now the last point that I make on this slide is that this process involves enzymes that reduce carbon dioxide to carbohydrate. Okay, and again, whenever you see reduce, remember we're talking about redox reactions. And so reduce, Leo says GER, so reduce was the gain electrons, okay? And that makes sense because notice I say involves enzymes that reduce carbon dioxide to a carbohydrate. And I taught you that trick of how the wording is kind of reversed. Whenever you reduce in these formulas, picture making something bigger. And so carbohydrate is bigger than carbon dioxide. Okay, if you're unsure of anything going on in this slide, please make sure to send me a message in the Remind app, and I'd be more than happy to clarify even further. Now, when we talk about the light reactions, we can further break this down into two pathways as well. Okay, so now the two pathways that you see here, you have the non-cyclic and the cyclic pathways. And you see them written as PS1 or PS2. And what that stands for is photosystem 1 or photosystem 2. Now, both of these pathways, their purpose is to produce ATP, which you know ATP is the ultimate goal in a lot of things. That is the usable energy for cells. And whenever you hear ATP, remind yourself that the energy is in those phosphate bonds. Okay? Now, when you see these different light reactions, when you see non-cyclic, I want you to circle the N of non-cyclic and remind yourself that this one is for production of NADPH, okay? NADPH. So circle the N of non-cyclic pathway to remind yourself production of NADPH. That NADPH will then be used in the Calvin cycle. And what does the Calvin cycle do? Reduces carbon dioxide to carbohydrate. Okay, so that's the function. So non-cyclic pathway, it serves to produce NADPH, which will then be used in the Calvin cycle for reducing carbon dioxide to carbohydrate. Now this process you see, it takes place in the thylakoid membrane, part of the chloroplast, right? And it involves the passing of electrons via an electron transport chain. So the movement is from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1, which I know always confuses students because they're like, wait, isn't 1 usually before 2? But remind yourself, just like reduced makes something bigger, 2 comes before 1, because scientists are weird like that, okay? Now, again, anytime you see the term electron transport chain, just always picture that image that we had with the staircase where the high energy electrons are passed down those staircases, and at each step there's a little bit of that ATP coming out to be usable, okay? Now again, we don't go into the crazy details of these processes because that's more for biochemistry. This is just to kind of give you the main ideas of what's going on. But if you ever want any extra details, again, just send me a message and remind. I'll give you some good videos, or I'll further explain certain topics. Now, we said that this occurs in the thylakoid membrane. And what we mean by the thylakoid membrane, these are basically membrane-bound compartments inside of that energy organelle known as the chloroplast. And so when you look at the thylakoid membrane, you see all of these important parts of what we've been talking about so far. So you have photosystem 2, which is over here. You have photosystem 1, and connecting them, you have that transfer of electrons down an electron transport chain. You also have ATP synthase, which you saw in cellular respiration. And anytime you see ATP synthase, chemoosmosis, that's all part of that, tied to the electron transport chain. Anytime you see that ATP synthase, chemoosmosis, I want you to always remind yourself what ATP synthase, what creation of ATP means. Again, it's the addition of a phosphate group to ADP, which is that adenosine diphosphate. Okay, and by giving that third phosphate to the molecule and then letting that molecule go off into the cell, other parts of the cell that then need energy can break that bond and use the energy. Okay, so whenever you see ATP synthase, remind yourself that that's responsible for adding a phosphate group, so it shows it over here, adding a phosphate group to ADP to make ATP, okay, which is the big energy for the cell. Now, ATP production in this thylakoid space, you basically have a reservoir of hydrogen ions, which serve as the electrons to move along the electron transport chain. Now, the flow of these ions from high to low energy provides kinetic energy. So remember, in the earlier chapters, we mentioned kinetic energy is movement, okay, movement energy. And that allows the ATP synthase to then produce the ATP, which I reminded you before. It produces it by adding a phosphate group to ADP, and we call that chemoosmosis. Okay? So for how is ATP produced, you can write down the flow of the ions, so the flow of the hydrogen ions from high to low energy, because remember, that's what the electron transport chain is. So high to low energy provides kinetic energy. So ATP synthase can produce ATP from ADP. And again, we call that chemoosmosis, which you've seen in our other lessons as well. Now, there are other types of reactions to be aware of. So the Calvin cycle reactions, you have what's called C3 photosynthesis. This process uses atmospheric carbon dioxide to make carbohydrates. And how do you have atmospheric carbon dioxide? Well, think, what do you breathe out all the time, right? So you breathe out carbon dioxide that the plants then use, and the plants then give you oxygen to breathe in. Okay, so they're very important with cycling for us as well. But now, this cycle, the C3 photosynthesis, you see 3 stages on here: carbon dioxide fixation, carbon dioxide reduction, and Ruby P generation. So what these terms mean: first you have carbon dioxide fixation, and in this, carbon dioxide is attached to the Ruby P molecule, and Ruby P is simply a 5-carbon molecule. Now, at the end of that, because you attached carbon dioxide to the 5-carbon Ruby P, you now have a 6-carbon molecule. That 6-carbon molecule now splits into 2 3-carbon molecules, which is the 3-PG, or sometimes you see it written as G3P. Okay, so when you have that process, there's an enzyme called Ruby P carboxylase, which helps speed up that reaction. Okay, and I don't know if they show that in the figure on the slide. No, they don't show the enzyme. So just keep in mind that enzymes are always helping through all of these processes. And then at that point, you now have 2 3-carbon molecules. They go into carbon dioxide reduction, and each of them are reduced into what's called G3P, and that's using NADPH and ATP. Now again, these terms you do not have to memorize. I'm just going through it in case you encounter it in your readings. But again, this is not biochemistry, so I won't quiz you or test you on the terminology of 3-PG going into G3P or any of that. Okay, just be aware that this process has 3 steps: fixation, reduction, and Ruby P generation. And that last step, basically, like it says, is generation or regeneration of Ruby P from any remaining carbons that have gone through the cycle. And this allows the cycle to then, jumpstart once again, and as any cycle does, keep going around in circles. Okay, so carbon dioxide fixation was simply linking the carbon dioxide to Ruby P so that you can have a 6-carbon molecule to split in half. That 6-carbon molecule was then further processed in carbon dioxide reduction, and then Ruby P was generated in the final steps to allow the cycle to go around once again. Now, the reason why the Calvin cycle is important in terms of the real world is that product that it was making when it broke down the 6-carbon molecule into the 2 halves and then further processed them into what they called G3P. That's important because that G3P is then used to make other very important carbohydrates, which you can see on this slide include sucrose, starch, and cellulose. Okay, so it's all related to important building blocks within the cell. Okay, so as you see, that G3P, the Calvin cycle's product, ended up helping produce more of the biomolecules that cells need. Okay, so that photosynthesis that we were just focusing on, that we called C3 photosynthesis, that one we mentioned was revolving around Ruby P carboxylase and that Ruby P molecule we said. Now in your notes, I want you to write that that C3 photosynthesis was for normal plants, the kind of normal everyday plants that you usually encounter in your normal environment. There are, however, other types of photosynthesis, specifically 2 others that I want you to be aware of. And I want you to know the difference between these guys versus the normal C3 plants. So the first one we have here is C4 photosynthesis. This one we refer to as an adaptation to avoid photorespiration. And I want you to circle, star, highlight the fact that C4 you find in hot, dry climates. And a trick to remembering that this is the one in hot, dry climates, you can think C4 explosions, right? C4 explosives, think hot and dry. Now, in that hot, dry weather, think about it. Normally, the stomata of leaves close in order to conserve water, okay? So what that means is those little openings that you would see on the plant leaves that's trying to be part of gathering and releasing any products from photosynthesis. These guys, they close. So the leaves become closed off in order to conserve water, because in hot, dry climates, you need to save as much water as possible. Now, because the leaves are closing off their little pores, if you think about it, nothing can really enter very well, right? Not just is it keeping water in, it's also preventing carbon dioxide from entering. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, the plant relies normally on carbon dioxide for their proper photosynthesis to occur. They take in carbon dioxide, they release oxygen. So now by closing their leaves off, they're holding water in, which is a good thing, but they're also preventing carbon dioxide from entering, and they're preventing oxygen from exiting, which means that oxygen is going to start to build up in their cells. So what these plants do is they use an enzyme called PEP carboxylase, and they use that enzyme because it does not bind to oxygen instead of carbon dioxide when oxygen levels are high in the cell. Okay, and basically what that means, so what this means is basically the advantages is that in C4 photosynthesis, there's no photorespiration, so the plant is not losing water, and the plants basically get to keep their pores shut for a longer period of time. And ultimately, this is something that you would find in hot, dry climates. Now, keep in mind, you may not really encounter these as much because only about 5% of all the plants around would be C4 kind of plants. Okay. Now, CAM is another type of photosynthesis, and the difference with this one is that it basically splits the job of carbon fixation based on time. So the stomata, meaning those little pores in the plant leaves, will only open at night, and that's when they'll take in carbon dioxide. But at that point, they won't lose as much water, since now at nighttime, if you think about what it feels like at night, it's a lot cooler out than during the day when the sun is really beating down on you. So that's the only time that they'll open their stomata. And so what they end up doing with this splitting up of the job is during the night, they'll fix carbon dioxide and form C4 molecules that they then store in their vacuoles. And remember, vacuoles can be like little sacs within a cell. And then during the day, they'll release those molecules to release carbon dioxide to the Calvin cycle. And that's basically when ATP and NADPH are then available, because if it's during the day, think of light reactions occurring during the day. So we said light reactions would produce the ATP and NADPH that you would then need for the Calvin cycle. Okay, so again, when it comes to these different forms of photosynthesis, I don't want you to go into all of the details of what's happening every step and whatnot. What I care is focusing on the adaptation value of these, and I'm going to summarize it on the next slide so that you can really see what to focus in on in this in these slides for different types of photosynthesis. So when you think of photosynthesis, basically, what do I want you to know? For our purposes, the first thing I want you to know is that there are 3 different forms of photosynthesis depending on the plants and the environment. C3 those are the plants that are your normal plants, okay? So you can write normal plants in quotation marks. These are the plants that are best adapted to the cooler climates with more rainfall, which is most of the normal places that people would inhabit, okay? Because people also like cooler, more rainfall. C4, on the other hand, remember C4, think explosions, that's the hot, dry climate. Okay, so C4 plants are hot, dry climates. And then the CAM plants, their focus is on what we call extreme aridity, meaning extreme dryness. So CAM plants are best adapted to extreme dryness. CAM plants, the example I want you to think of is a cactus. Okay, so when you see the CA of CAM, you can circle that and write cactus to remind yourself very, very dry locations, because that's the one that really maximizes holding in water even better than the C4 plants, which try to kind of retain some water as well. Now, ultimately, when you think about any of these kinds of photosynthesis, these adaptations are all based on the need to conserve water, because if you think about it, what do plants want more than anything? They want water, okay? Now, they also need to avoid wasteful processes under, certain environmental conditions, meaning avoid processes that would lose water, that would decrease water. So they're trying to basically hold in as much water as possible and reduce any of the processes that might allow water to kind of leak out of them. And when I say leak out of them, it's not that you would visually be able to see this, you don't see the leaves like crying, but when they have their stomata open, meaning those little pores on the leaves, so whenever I say stomata, remember little pores on leaves, when they have that open, that becomes an exit as well as an entrance. So those little stomata can lose water molecules out of the plant, even if you don't think about it. Okay, so again, adaptations are based on the need to conserve water and reduce wasteful processes that might lose water. Okay, and now to summarize this, I'm going to play a video for you to see photosynthesis and really visualize some of what we've been talking about.
Plants provide us with food to eat and oxygen to breathe. They perform this amazing feat by the process of photosynthesis. Let's take a closer look. Photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide, which diffuses into the leaf through small pores,
Those small pores
and then
of
enters the
stomata.
cells. Inside the cell, carbon dioxide diffuses into the chloroplasts, where photosynthesis takes place. Chloroplasts use energy from light to transform carbon dioxide and water into sugar and oxygen. Zooming into a chloroplast, we see these flattened membranous sacs called thylakoids. Here, light energy is converted to chemical energy in the first phase of photosynthesis, the light reactions. The two green structures you see here are photosystems, large complexes of proteins and chlorophyll that capture light energy. An electron transport chain connects the two photosystems. Notice the small mobile electron carriers that shuttle electrons from one large complex to another. Now let's take a closer look at the steps of the light reactions. The photosystem on the left absorbs light energy, exciting electrons that enter the electron transport chain. Electrons are replaced with electrons stripped from water, creating oxygen as a byproduct. The energized electrons flow down the electron transport chain, releasing energy that is used to pump hydrogen ions, the blue balls, into the thylakoid. In the photosystem on the right, light energy excites electrons, and this time the electrons are captured by an electron carrier molecule, NADPH. The high concentration of hydrogen ions inside the thylakoid powers ATP synthase, producing ATPs. The light reactions in the thylakoid have produced two energy products, ATP and NADPH, that will now power the production of sugar in the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle takes place outside the thylakoids in the stroma, the thick fluid of the chloroplast. At the beginning of the cycle, carbon dioxide molecules combine with molecules called RUBP. The resulting molecules go through a series of reactions powered by ATP and NADPH from the light reactions. Sugar molecules known as G3Ps are produced. Most of the G3Ps are rearranged back into RUBPs that will begin the Calvin cycle again. But the important product of photosynthesis is the remaining G3P sugar. Some G3Ps are used to build glucose, which can combine into starch or cellulose. Still other G3Ps form sucrose. And some of the sugar is broken down by cellular respiration using oxygen in the plant's own mitochondria, generating ATPs that can power other work of the plant. Excess oxygen diffuses out of the leaf through the pores, while more carbon dioxide enters. With three simple ingredients, carbon dioxide, water, and light, plants produce sugar and oxygen by photosynthesis, powering plant metabolism and ultimately providing your fuel as well.
Okay, so as you saw in that video, that did a beautiful job in terms of really summarizing and helping you to visualize a lot of the things we talked about today. When you think of photosynthesis, I want you to make sure that you are very comfortable with the difference between photosynthesis and cellular respiration in terms of what exactly is going on. So make sure you remember that photosynthesis is taking carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight to make glucose and oxygen. Okay, so glucose and oxygen are the products. Make sure you're comfortable with the type of organisms that would do this and the various steps or processes that they would do in order to, achieve this goal, as well as the adaptations that we talked about. So like I said, I won't be nitpicky in terms of intermediates and exact, products throughout the different reactions, but do make sure you know the various reactions spoken about, so know their names, as well as their main functions, okay? And if there's more than one, make sure you know how they differ. So for instance, how does the light reaction differ from the Calvin cycle reaction, okay? And again, things like knowing, how are electrons passed? They're passed from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1, okay? So things like that can easily pop up again. Now, yet another chapter you have now completed, so make sure at the end of every chapter to be adding that chapter to that week's study guide, okay? And to think about any questions that you would then want to post on the discussion board related to that chapter. As always, if you have any questions, you need any further clarification, or you just want some practice problems to kind of see, what I may target when I look at this chapter, just send me a message and remind. I'm always more than happy to help. Okay? Thank you and have a wonderful day.